Good evening. Cole, you may need to kick me up a few notches on that microphone volume. I'm going to try not to strain my voice. Instinct is to do that. All right, now we're ready. So thankful that you're here. Just a quick word about the Teacher Appreciation Sunday. I've not done a great job of making all the details known, so for those of you who this impacts that are here tonight, we'll start with you, but just pass this along and we'll do some more mass communication over the next week. But that'll be at the beginning of our assembly next Sunday morning. So before we worship, we'll appreciate all of our teachers and thank them in here, everyone at 10 o'clock, and then we'll worship after that. And then after the worship assembly is finished, we will feed our teachers that we've honored, past and present, as well as your household. So even if your spouse didn't teach, we want them to stay. Even if your children obviously are not teaching age, we want them to stay. So please be sure that you know we want to honor you and reward you and appreciate you by being here and then by letting us feed you, catering that meal. Thankful for Paul for taking care of those details, lining that up, and for our elders in saying we want to show our appreciation in a strong way, a clear way. So be sure that you're here at 10. Be sure that you plan to stay for lunch if that affects you as a teacher's household. Here is the daily Bible reading, at least a summary of what we're going to try to do, and we'll try to connect our PM sermons to the reading. It's been in the bulletin, but I've not quite got the card finished. It's got the whole year on it. And just in light of tonight's lesson, no excuses, no one to blame, it's just not quite finished. But if you'd like to take a picture of that, you're welcome to before I change the slide, but just simply one chapter a day from the New Testament, one psalm a day, and that'll be something we attempt to connect throughout the year on Sunday nights. So back in 2021, we took a trip to Guntersville State Park, not the state park, but a park near Guntersville State Park on Lake Guntersville. And within this park that our house, little cabin was in, they also had a trail that we could take. And the map they provided for the trail said that it was a 1 mile hike to the lake. And so we thought we can handle a mile. And so we set out after breakfast and we hiked this quote mile. And when we finally got back several hours later to the cabin, I checked my phone as it had tracked the distance, and it said we had walked over 4 miles. So now when you go back and you look at the literature that the camp produces, it actually says it's over a 2 mile trek to go to the water. We were tired. It started raining on the way. We didn't really know where we were going. It was incredibly elevated. Okay, you're hiking to the water's edge, but there were multiple hills between the cabin and the water's edge, which meant you had to go up multiple hills and then down multiple hills to get back to the water. We got back, we were tired, our feet were wet because whoever was in the front leading the way saw a shortcut through grass, and remember it had been raining, so our socks and our shoes were soaked. Who's at fault for that morning hike? There's a problem with the question just as much as anything. The problem is with the setup and the question more than determining who's actually at fault. Because I just told you the negative events, right? Here's the picture of us at the water's edge. We don't look all that miserable, do we? Overall, it was a great trip. It was a trip of memories, a hike of memories. We talked about it, kind of maybe because it was on my mind, but we talked about it on the car this afternoon after lunch. A lot of great things happened. But if we wanted to take a time to say, well, what caused all the negatives? Who was at fault? We could blame the park for mistyping on the map. We could blame ourselves for not preparing and measuring the distance ahead of time, for not carrying enough water or snacks or something. We could blame all we wanted. We could complain about the hills and the rain that was falling. We could defend ourselves and say, well, we did our best, but nobody else came through. We could defend. But none of that would change the negatives. And in fact, they would overshadow all the positives that did happen. So tonight, and then throughout the course, in some capacity, throughout the course of our Sunday nights, what we want to focus on is the contrast between disciplined responses, which is what God would have us to do, and default reactions, which is what we so often get caught up in. Now, these two phrases in contrast with one another, I've heard through a man named Tim Kite, as well as these three categories on the next slide. But you'll see this in any number of other people's literature in terms of betterment and improvement and living a life of discipline. What God has made clear to us is how we can live responsible lives, which means we're able to respond in any circumstance. That we don't have to play the victim card. We don't have to view the world through the lens of you're either a victim or you're oppressor. That we're just a victim mindset. We don't have to fall into that thinking. We can discipline ourselves to live with appropriate, healthy responses. So as we move into this tonight to introduce these categories and just make ourselves aware of them, what we want to do is not only observe the negative, the default reactions, but especially place our emphasis on the positive responses that God makes available to us. So the first default reaction, the negative reaction, is that of blame. That we shift the blame, that we look at others and think, well, they must be at fault. If they wouldn't have done this, if they would have done that, then I wouldn't be in this situation where I'm at. We're always thinking ahead of who might be the one who actually caused it to happen. And I'll say on the front end, of the three, this is my biggest weakness. I can find myself doing all three plenty, but especially with my words to the people I'm around the most and care about the most, this is probably the one I go to the most. But when I have the courage to examine my own thoughts, this is the one that pops up way more than any. That before I even realize it, I've thought of one or two or three or 10 people who, well, if they would have just, or if they wouldn't have done, well, now here I am. So this one's a tough one. They're all tough. They all can become instinctive when they ought not to be. But to blame others. Romans 2, verse 1, Paul writing to these Jews who have become Christians, but they have a checkered past. Therefore, you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. Blaming is always downstream from judgment. We have to make a judgment in order to then assign blame to someone else. Similar statement in a slightly different context. The meat offered to idols discussion and letting others be weak and strong, that kind of deal in Romans 14, verse 10. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. Verse 12, each of us will give an account of himself to God. We might be quick when something goes wrong, when something's not like how we like it, to immediately and instinctively say, well, it must be someone else's fault. The second is to complain, to just gripe about the circumstances, to say, well, the circumstance isn't right, it's just wrong from the beginning, to think in those terms. Clearly, the Old Testament Israelites had a problem with griping and complaining against God. Other statements you find in the Old Testament about complaining, Psalm 106, verse 25, they murmured in their tents. They did not obey the voice of the Lord. That's about the Israelites. You see the connection. Because they murmured, because they stayed to themselves, because they wouldn't get out and obey God, they wouldn't build each other up, they did not keep his commands. Proverbs 10 and verse 19, when words are many, transgression is not lacking. But whoever restrains his lips is prudent. Circumstances might be less than ideal, but that doesn't guarantee that we need to say something about it. Just because they're not like they ought to be doesn't mean we need to be the ones to bring attention to it. Then Ephesians 4:29 from the New Testament, let no corrupting talk come from your mouths, but only such as is good for building up. See, complaining tears down. Complaining highlights negatives. Look at what all's wrong. Let's fix all of this. Y'all need to fix this. I can't operate as long as this is that way. only such as good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. But then the final category of the default reaction, the negative reaction that keeps us from being responsible, is to defend, to argue and to say, well, I'm always right. I know that I'm right in this circumstance. Psalm 36, verse number 2. For he flatters himself, this is the wicked man from verse 1, he flatters himself in his own eyes that his iniquity cannot be found out and hated. He builds himself up. He says, look, I'm the one who knows what to do. I'm the one who's always doing right. A defensive spirit will always keep us from being responsible. Proverbs 28, verse 13, whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. The person who's always defending instead of being willing to own up to shortcomings will never prosper. You don't see people who are truly successful in their relationships and in their excellence in life who get there by being defensive. So, all three of these, we'll find plenty of overlap between each other. Every person who's ever lived will, outside of Jesus himself, will struggle with these at times and in seasons and in certain ways. But we need to see the danger of these, because the more they build over time and the more we grow unaware of them, the more they build barriers. They build barriers between us and God to keep us from growing in His sight. They certainly build barriers between us and others to carry out the godly behaviors that we need to in our relationships. So we must be aware of them without making all of our emphasis be upon them. And there does become a point at which it's an inescapable cycle. If we keep blaming, and we keep complaining about complaining, and we keep being defensive about these behaviors. And so God has showed us to be aware of these, yes, but He also shows us more than enough positive responses to discipline ourselves in so that we can overcome them and can please Him through them. So the positives to these, instead of blaming, the disciplined response is to accept. That may not always be to accept blame. It might be to accept that I cannot do anything about it. But to have an awareness that accepts neutrally, here's what happened. Here's what someone else did. Here's what I did. Here's what just happened beyond anyone's control. But when we approach these situations with an attitude that's willing to accept truth and reality, that also sets us up to be able to accept blame and responsibility when necessary. It would be just as unhealthy to go about saying, well, I'm always at fault. I'm the worst person in the world. I've just ruined everything. That's unhealthy too. Having an honest spirit to accept truth means we know what we can control and what we cannot. And it means that we accept blame when we need to accept it, but also are able to move on without shifting blame onto others. This affects us, of course, when we're directly hurt by someone else. Someone else I keep up with quite a bit is Dr. Henry Cloud, and he just illustrates this pretty succinctly. He said if somebody trips you or pushes you down and they break your leg, yes, they're at fault. But which one are you going to take control of? Are you going to let blaming them, focusing on them, harping on them, telling everyone in the world how bad they are, instead of focusing on your healing? Just imagine if you laid there with a broken leg just talking about how bad the person was who tripped you, when you need to call an ambulance or your spouse to get you in the car and take you to the doctor. And you need to commit to a doctor doing surgery and commit to healing and exercise and rehab. You can commit to owning the situation, which is my healing, or you can commit to focusing a negative spotlight on the person that caused it. But we don't have room in our hearts to do both. So acceptance is the starting point, whether that means accepting our own faults or accepting the healing that happens when others hurt us, or even simply having a neutral mindset that says some things are in my control, some things are not, and I'm going to focus on the things that I can control. All right, here's the positive response to complaining, which is to thank, to express gratitude. Just think of how much would have been different with the Israelites. Instead of complaining about everything God didn't do, they would have just simply thanked him for what he did do, what he was doing, what he had done. Now, I mentioned Kite. Tim Kite is the one that I've heard some of this stuff from. He offers action as the foil for complaining, but I tend to think of gratitude and thankfulness a little more connected to that as an inward thing. It'll certainly lead to certain actions. But we need to be thankful instead of saying, well, everything's wrong, and until everything's perfect, I can't be grateful. When we decide to be grateful for what is good and is true and is right and is holy, then we can always move forward. That list of Philippians 4, verse 8 is extremely helpful in moments where we might be tempted to complain. What is true about this situation? What is honorable about the situation? What's pure about the situation? What's just? What's lovely? What's commendable? What is excellent? What is worthy of praise? Just pausing to think through that list begins to turn our attention away from the cause of complaint and toward things that are worth remembering and worth being grateful for. So think on those things and then thank God for those things. Potentially thank other people for those things to rob the power of complaining out of our hearts. But then instead of defending, the third place, we can learn. Instead of defending my behavior as I know I have everything 100% right here. We can acknowledge, well, I've done my best up to this point. I did everything I knew to do, but I can always learn more about what to do next time. I can always improve and grow. So we ask the Lord, help me to grow and learn to prepare for next time. We can ask others for feedback. How can I learn and grow better from how I mishandled it then, or what I overlooked then, or did or didn't do then? So those are positive discipline responses the Lord makes available to us that will undermine the power of the negative reactions that if we allow it to remain, will take us out. Just think about our health. We mentioned the example of the broken leg and all that. We might fear a lot of external injuries in our minds, but if we go through and we take the most dangerous things to our health, most of them are internal first. The most dangerous things to us. And one, bit of plaque in our arteries may not seem all that much of a threat. But what happens when it builds over years and over decades? What happens when it builds in the wrong place, the wrong arteries? It's internal. We don't know it's a problem until it is a problem. Well, likewise, when these blaming, complaining, defending reactions begin to build in our hearts, we may not realize it until they begin to cause damage and shrapnel in our lives and our relationships. So we need to focus on the beauty of these things. Accept, thank, learn. Let them become as instinctive as possible to shift the attention away from the negative and to keep seeking them with the help of God. I think the neat thing about this is that if we'll begin to think of other people that we would categorize as the ones in blue, he or she, they just own it. They have an attitude of ownership. They're willing to apologize. They're willing to do the right things. When they do mess up, they're willing to take responsibility. They're really grateful. They're always saying thank you. You can tell they live a life of gratitude. He or she is always learning. They always want to know more. They're asking for feedback. They're taking advice. They're humble in how they learn and approach life. Those type of people that we would put in those categories, they're not born that way. They've had to overcome blaming and complaining and defending themselves. We would look at their lives and say, well, they just got it all figured out. Well, they got there with the Lord's help just as much as any of us can get there with the Lord's help. To illustrate, think about someone like Ozzie Smith. He dives to his right as he's playing shortstop. It happens in a split second. He gets up and he fires to first base. Bang, bang, it's over before we know it. We would say, well, that's some amazing instincts. Look at his reaction time. We would use those words. But for him, that's a disciplined response. He's built that over years and decades. He's thought through it. He's figured out the angles. He's made it become instinctual because he needed to play his position the best he could. You go to a classroom in a middle school or a high school, and you see a teacher, and she's in the front of the room, and there's a few of the problem kids that are beginning to get a little sideways with their behavior. And you wonder, are they going to overtake the room? Are they going to get their way? And she immediately, but calmly and lovingly steps toward them and neutralizes the situation, and they nod their heads and say, "Yes, ma'am." It was over in an instinct. She probably didn't think through it and get all worked up. She just acted. We would say from the outside, well, that's an incredible reaction. Look at her instincts. And yet she's prepared for that moment over time when it was tested. Likewise, you take soldiers or maybe a SWAT team, a law enforcement team, and they're carrying out some dangerous mission, and they're suddenly surprised by an attack. And one of them has to fire, and they neutralize the attacker. We would look at that and say, just what amazing reactions they had. Look at their instincts. And yet again, they've built it over time, knowing they might be tested in that way, knowing it comes with the job, not waiting on their default reactions to just somehow work out, to not keep going down the same well of failure, but instead to build the disciplined responses so that they could do the right things in the right way. So we move to wind down for the evening. Listen to how the thread of responsibility works through James chapter 1, beginning of verse 19. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Because the command is for every person, that also means it's possible for every person to decide to just listen, to be excited to hear even. First the Word of God, but also to others. Let every person. There's not a category of people that, well, I've just been given a tough state in life and I'm just going to be a blamer all my days. No, every person can learn to be quick to hear. Every person can work with the help of the Lord, through the Lord, to be slow to speak. Every person can work to be slow to letting their emotions get away from them. Then you look at verse 21. Therefore, put away. Every person can put away all filthiness, rampant wickedness, and instead replace that with an attitude of meekness with the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Here, responsibility in verse 21. Every person can know where salvation comes from. It comes from God, revealed in His Word. So every person can choose to receive it, to hear it, to obey it, to enjoy the salvation it gives. When we're talking about this concept of responsibility, we're not saved. We don't come to God for salvation with faith and trust until we're first willing to own our decisions and our thoughts. 25, chapter 1. The one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty. Well, who's this blessing to, promised to? Who does it go to? It goes to anyone who looks in the right place, the perfect law of liberty. And then anyone who perseveres. Means from anywhere in life, we can always look into the Word of God. From anywhere in life, any circumstances, we can always persevere. From anywhere in life, listen to the next phrase, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts. He'll be blessed in his doing. Look at those three things. The law of liberty, doing, looking into it, persevering, doing. From any circumstance, from any pain or trauma or setback, from any level of success, from any unexpected circumstance, those three decisions are always within our grasp. We can always choose to exercise looking into the Word of God, choosing to remain faithful, choosing to keep on doing. God makes it available and shows us He is the way. He is the way for salvation, but He's also the way to continually bringing our discipline under control that we might please Him. We'll stop for the night. I'd planned to get into blaming tonight, but the voice is done. Not blaming my voice, but it's done. So tonight, if you've not obeyed that perfect law of liberty, if you don't know the salvation, the joy that comes from following God and knowing God, choose tonight, as the night you do put him on in baptism, to enjoy his forgiveness, to know that he makes it clear. He makes it certain when and where and how we can know that we're saved. If you need the prayers of the church for forgiveness of sins, if you need prayers of strength for anything else, please know that we're always here for you. But we're especially here for you during these few minutes to give you the opportunity to come to know his love and grace. If you need to come to him now as we sing.